The Analyzing Instrument, Unconscious Communication and Classical Psychoanalysis. A Historical Journey of Intersubjectivity and the Unconscious. Part 1. He, the analyst, must turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ towards the transmitting unconscious of the patient. He must adjust himself to the patient as a telephone receiver is adjusted to the transmitting microphone. Just as the receiver converts back into sound waves the electrical oscillations in the telephone line, which were set up by sound waves, so the doctor's unconscious is able, from the derivatives of the unconscious, which are communicated to him, to reconstruct that unconscious, which has determined the patient's free associations. Freud, 1912, pages 115 to 116. If there is a Big Bang statement from which the universe of intersubjectivity has emanated, it is the quote above from Freud's paper, Recommendations to Physicians Practicing Psychoanalysis. It contains within it the basic elements from which the various factors that comprise the intersubjective exchange, see Chapter 1, have been constructed as they have evolved over the last century. This quote is sandwiched between Freud's discussion of how the analyst's evenly suspended attention is a correlate of the patient's free associations and his proposal that the analyst use his unconscious as an instrument in the analysis. 1912, page 116. There is an implicit assumption that the evenly suspended attention of the analyst and the analysand's free associations are linked, though this linkage remains unexamined. Similarly, Freud leaves us tantalized by the notion of an unconscious that can be both transmitting as well as a receptive organ. Furthermore, it is the analyst's unconscious that is able to reconstruct that unconscious, which has determined that patient's free associations p. 116. How does the unconscious achieve this understanding, and are we to assume that the patient's unconscious is similarly tuned into that of the analyst? And finally, what did Freud have in mind when he said that the analyst must adjust himself to the patient, advice that seems to counsel against a rigid one-size-fits-all approach to technique? Note that Freud attributes these complex processes to an unconscious that is capable of encoding, transmitting, receiving, interpreting, and working collaboratively with another unconscious. In discussing the relationship between the unconscious and consciousness, Freud, 1915c, states, "It is a very remarkable thing that the UCS of one human being can react upon that of another without passing through the CS, page 194. Freud continues by saying that this deserves closer investigation, page 194, but he proceeds to elaborate the interactions between the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious while leaving aside the question of how one mind unconsciously communicates with another. Indeed, Freud never returns to this topic, and it does not receive analytic attention again until the early 1940s. Instead, his writings, like those of other analysts of the period, are concerned with the intersystemic relations between the three levels of consciousness. Later, with the introduction of the structural theory, Freud, 1923a, he becomes largely focused in his metapsychological works on ID, ego, and superego, as well as concerned with the question of anxiety. Freud, 1926. Although Freud, 1923a, located some part of the ego as unconscious, he did not deal with the possibility that this portion of the ego was involved in unconscious communication. See chapters 4 and 5. Before continuing with our inquiry into unconscious communication and the analyzing instrument, we must take a lateral detour to pick up some concepts from two of Freud's contemporaries that we will need as we move forward. Sandor Ferenczi, a member of Freud's inner circle, was a close confidant and sometimes ambivalent friend. Their quarter-century relationship is a poignant story of allegiances, conflict, and feelings of betrayal for both men. From the outset of their relationship, Ferenczi had wished for a greater mutuality between them and was frustrated by Freud's reluctance to engage in a reciprocal analysis. Indeed, the question of mutuality, which blurred the distinction between patient and analyst, dogged their friendship until Ferenczi's death in 1933. A major source of friction between Freud and Ferenczi was the latter's involvement with patients that experimented with shared disclosures, culminating at the end of his career with a technical innovation he called mutual analysis, in which analyst and analysand took turns analyzing each other. Berman, 2004. While this approach was highly criticized by the analytic community, it was Ferenczi who broke new ground in elevating the important role of the analyst's mind as a factor in the analytic interaction, and also exploring analyst disclosure. However, Ferenczi also introduced concepts that were not controversial and have become accepted into the psychoanalytic canon. He, Ferenczi, 1909, coined the term introjection to describe a psychological mechanism that accounted for some of the dynamics of neurotic patients. Freud, 1894, had already introduced the notion of projection in his analysis of the mechanisms of paranoia, and Ferenczi thought that whereas the paranoic expels from his ego the impulses that have become unpleasant, the neurotic helps himself by taking into the ego as large as possible a part of the world. One might give to this process, in contrast to projection, the name of introjection. Ferenczi, 1909, page 47. For Freud, projection was a means of unburdening the psyche of unwanted impulses, with no consideration given to the effect upon the object. Ferenczi, on the other hand, adds an object-relational component to his understanding of introjection. The neurotic is constantly seeking for objects with whom he can identify himself, to whom he can transfer feelings, whom he can thus draw into his circle of interest, i.e., introject. Pages 47 to 48. Projection and introjection later will be employed by subsequent generations of analysts as the means by which the individual psyche, including that of the analyst, relates to another mind, and also how unconscious communication transmits and receives unconscious dispatches. Ferenczi also pioneered the idea that countertransference may be put to a positive use. Freud, 1910b, had admonished his followers to be wary of feelings toward the analysand and to suppress these. While the patient attaches himself to the physician is subject to a similar process, that of countertransference. This countertransference must be completely overcome by the analyst. Only this will make him master of the psychoanalytic situation. It makes him the perfectly cool object who the other person must lovingly woo. p. 447. These comments to the Vienna Society are in apparent conflict with his statement 2 years later recommending that the analyst use his unconscious as an instrument of the analysis, and they reflect Freud's ambivalence about the analyst's subjective reactions, perhaps accounting for his lack of pursuing further a study of unconscious communication. Ferenczi had obviously been reflecting on Freud's prescription regarding countertransference when he wrote to Freud in 1911. Besides monitoring the countertransference, one must also pay heed to this being induced by the patients. Ferenczi, 1911, page 253. The belief that countertransference is induced by the patient suggests a purposive aspect to this induction, though Ferenczi does not expand on this idea. Thus, Ferenczi gives us several important tools that will be vital in our understanding of intersubjectivity, his prompting us to consider issues of mutual influence between patient and analyst, introjection, the positive use of countertransference, and the notion that the patient may unconsciously seek to induce these countertransference feelings in the analyst. Karl Abraham, a Berlin analyst and also one of Freud's inner circle, has significantly contributed to the conceptual foundation of intersubjectivity through his writings and, perhaps even more, through his influential analysands. He was in the vanguard of analysts who undertook the analytic treatment of schizophrenic and manic depressive patients, and he described the central role that processes of introjection and projection play in these disorders. Abraham referred to a psychosexual metabolism in speaking of the dynamics of mania. In his manic phase, he proclaims his power of assimilating all his objects into himself. But it is characteristic that this pleasurable act of taking in new impressions is correlated to an equally pleasurable act of ejecting them as soon as they have been received. Abraham, 1924, page 472. In outlining this rapid alternation between introjection and projection, Abraham was laying the groundwork for an understanding of how two minds transmit and receive unconscious communications. Furthermore, his application of Freud's and Ferenczi's concepts of projection and introjection to describe the manic patient style of relating to his objects introduces to psychoanalysis the idea of metabolism. To return to Freud's 1912 telephone analogy of unconscious communication, if projection and introjection are viewed as the mechanisms underlying transmission and reception, then metabolism may be seen as the means by which the doctor's unconscious is able, from the derivatives of the unconscious, which are communicated to him, to reconstruct that unconscious, which has determined the patient's free associations, pages 115 to 116. We know little of Abraham's clinical technique, and the Berlin School of Psychoanalysis was criticized for being too theoretical, Grubert Semitis, 1986. However, it seems safe to presume that his emphasis upon projection, introjection, and metabolism found its way into his practice of analysis and, by extension, into the thinking of his analysands. Indeed, several of his patients, Melanie Klein, Robert Fliess, and Theodore Rake, developed ideas that built upon the contributions of Freud, Ferenczi, and Abraham to offer a further scaffolding for our contemporary views on intersubjectivity. Melanie Klein, of course, placed projective and introjective processes at the center of her view of object relations. It is interesting to note that her first analyst was Ferenczi. However, we know little of that analysis during the time she lived in Budapest, Aguayo, 1997, gross girth, 1986. We will examine in greater depth the contributions of the Kleinian school in Chapter 3. Fliess and Rake have greatly extended our appreciation of the role that the analyst's mind plays in the therapeutic encounter, and we now turn to their work, having detoured through Ferenczi and Abraham.